Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, for I come with another sigcast on the centralization of power by the new monarchs in the 15th and 16th centuries. And yes, this is the next installment of the sigcast. And again, this is the third episode and final episode of the centralization of power by the new monarchs. So we've talked about Spain. We've talked about Philip, Ferdinand, and Isabella. We've talked about in France, Charles VII. We've talked about Louis XI, the Spider King, and then we've also gone into Richelieu, Louis XIII, and Cardinal Mazarin and the regency of Louis XIV and some of the turbulence with, again, power being stripped away over the nobility, and we've talked about revolts. So now we need to turn our eyes to the central eastern part of Europe, and this is where we begin today. With the success of Spain and France apparent, other European states began to say, hey, that's cool. I think I'll try to centralize according to the same model. And this example that I'm going to give you today is none other than Poland. So hopefully you have some Polish pride. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Poland seemed destined for greatness. Yes, I said it. Poland seemed destined for greatness in the 16th and 17th centuries. Russia was experiencing something called the Time of Troubles, which wasn't good. If you have an episode in your history named the Time of Troubles, it's probably pretty troubling. And so there's a power void there. And the Poles even captured for a few years Moscow until finally being driven out by 1613. When Sigismund II attempted to centralize power by 1572, basically the nobility there said, not having it. They refused to compromise. They refused to comply. And instead they chose to elect kings and keep their privileges. In reality, there were many ethnic and religious divisions which undermined Polish rulers any hope for unity. In addition, economically, in the Middle Ages, Poland was really in the front row. They were doing well. They profited from a lot of the overland commerce between the Black and Baltic Seas. But with the shifting of commercial routes, we haven't studied this yet, but you know it's coming. With the shifting of commercial routes to the centers of the West and in the Atlantic Ocean being more important than the Mediterranean, more important than the Baltic, more important than the Black Sea. Darn it, Columbus, you ruined Poland's chance of greatness. But economically, things were on a downturn. Worse, the Polish nobility was very protective of its own power and fearful of an alliance between middle-class merchants with money and being in cahoots with the king. They deliberately penalized these merchants by passing legislations to actually restrict trade. They also maintained that the majority of Polish people would remain serfs bound to the estates of the nobility, which again would preserve their power. And when Sigismund II died in 1572, the nobility saw it, this is their chance. They saw it that they were not going to have any more strong kings. No more strong kings would ascend to the throne. So they decided to monopolize their power in the Sejm, which is spelled S-E-J-M. It's the legislative body in Poland, much like the legislative body in France was known as the Estates General, or what Parliament is in England. And they monopolized their power in the Sejm and safeguarded their power with their rights by something called the Liberum Veto. You need to know this. The Liberum Veto mandated that any new legislation that was to be introduced had to be passed with a unanimous vote. And you know, politics is politics. That hardly ever happens, if at all. So thus began a state of political anarchy, and division became the norm in Poland. Nothing could be done to increase the power of the state. A political observer in the 17th century summed up the situation about Poland when he said, there's no order in the state, and everybody who is stronger thinks they have a right to oppress the weaker. The significance of this development is that it would result in the nobles exercising a large amount of local, uncentralized control. So in terms of the theme of this entire presentation, the last three sigcasts, what we see in the east and central part of Europe is the opposite, where we're seeing decentralization becoming cool again. So it was the opposite of absolutism, which was emerging in the West. Poland, like much of Eastern Europe, would forever remain uncentralized and controlled by agricultural-based nobility who enjoyed serfdom and unchecked powers. They benefited from remaining agrarian. The consequence of this was a lack of innovation, and Eastern Europe will not change and will not modernize at the same pace as their Western European counterparts. And into the 20th century, many of the nations in Eastern Europe still had serfs, peasants, and resembled the Middle Ages. This is why in the 20th century, if we could fast forward, radical ideas which mandated immediate change, like Marxism, like Leninism, and even anarchism, were attractive to many of the people in Eastern Europe. Ultimately, this is going to lead to Poland's weaknesses in the coming conflicts with their Central and European counterparts. Because a century later, by the 1800s, Poland will fail to exist as a sovereign state. It's going to be gone. Why? It's going to be sliced and diced or carved up by stronger neighbors, neighbors like Austria, Russia, and Prussia, in what will be called the three partitions of Poland. You heard it here first. That'll be down the line. So let's review the big picture of this entire presentation, the entire unit of this whole notion of centralization of power by what we call new monarchs. So what? Why is it important? Well, during the Middle Ages, period from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, saw the beginning of feudalism's decline. Feudalism was very efficient, as we know, in thwarting the invasions of barbarians such as Vikings, Magyars, and all those likes during the Dark Ages. While it served as a net protection after the fall of Rome fell for Europeans, uniting and organizing and centralizing taxation and military service into one government or ruler, usually a monarch, proved as time passed to be far superior. Centralizing power came at the expense of the nobility, losing many of their traditional rights. They lost not only their traditional rights, but they also lost privileges. They lost overall, let's face it, they were losing their power. So it's important to understand that early centralizing efforts proved to be successful and resulted in Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella and France under Charles VII and Louis XI to become the dominant powers in Europe early on from 1450 to 1648, along with even Sweden. But the other countries will soon catch them. So overall, the process of centralizing and organizing states began to advance during this era, but in the process, they would not be fulfilled in many areas until historical period 2 and 3, according to the AP College Board AP European History curriculum. Again, historical period 2 meaning 1648 to 1815, and historical period 3, 1815 to 1914. So likewise, it's important to understand that in Eastern and Central Europe, opposite of the West, the nobility maintains its power and remains feudal and rooted in an agricultural economy. Hope that helps. Again, review your notes. Make sure you go back and add things. We'll discuss this, possibly have a quiz the next time we meet in class. Thanks for listening. Take care.